Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today is James Matthew Wilson, a poet and philosopher who I interviewed back in episode 57 about his recent poem cycle, The River of the Immaculate Conception. He also appeared more briefly in episode 60 in a discussion with Andrew Dessau. And we're going to have 2 or 3 more episodes with him this month, discussing a masterpiece of a book that he wrote a few years ago called The Vision of the Soul. And since we explain what the book is about right at the top of the interview, let's just jump right in. James Matthew Wilson, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me again.
So we're back to talk about your book, The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition. And this is a book that came out a few years ago, was very acclaimed at the time, and it's certainly one of the best nonfiction books I've read that's a contemporary book in terms of its depth and, I think, rereadability. It covers a lot of ground, but I think probably be accurate to say that the central theme of it is the way that modernity has separated beauty from goodness and truth, and trying to reclaim the sort of identification of beauty with being goodness and truth as the core of the Western tradition. Would that be pretty accurate?
That's right. I guess this book does do a lot of things, because even in that one sentence, there were probably 4 or 5 things that I wanted to talk about. At the heart of it is, if we ask, what do conservatives want to conserve? The answers are not always forthcoming. And the most important answer that ought to be given is, we need to conserve a vision of reality and the human person's role in reality that's accurate and worthy of these things. And at the heart of that, I find, is the need for a defense of beauty, not necessarily after the fashion of the 19th century liberal humanism that's represented by somebody like Matthew Arnold, where beauty is a kind of final adornment on an otherwise functioning society, but rather a vision that recognizes beauty as a property of being, as in fact a dimension of reality so deeply threaded through it all that we can't possibly understand what is real without having some account of beauty. So beauty isn't necessarily a perfection or, again, an adornment. It's actually something fundamental that we have to understand if we're to respond to what reality has to teach us accurately.
You begin the book with, you mentioned conservatism and beauty are not things that are too readily associated in the contemporary mind. Now, conservatives will use truth, goodness, and beauty. And, when I was at a small Catholic liberal arts college for a brief period of time, I honestly felt like they were all sort of thrown around as buzzwords, and the the beauty part got sort of the short end of the stick. But there's real reasons, in other words, that conservatism is not associated now with the arts or with putting a high emphasis on beauty. But you make a very interesting and compelling argument for that being sort of the origins of conservatism. Before that, at the beginning of the book, you make some points as to why it's a mistake that we commonly associate cultural and artistic vitality with liberalism. So why don't we actually start there?
Sure. Yeah, that was one of the genesis moments of writing this book, was contemplating what the Western tradition as a whole looks like and has to teach us. And what it has to teach us primarily can really be kind of summed up by Plato in the Republic. Most people are content with a fairly shallow vision of the world, that life, that reality as such is just a series of shadows, a series of appearances. But in fact, even a few moments rational reflection compels us to recognize that a shadow has to be projected from something, that whatever appears to us is but the appearance of a deeper and richer whole. And so a full knowledge of the truth will transcend appearances or go more deeply into them until it reaches what's beyond them. And a rich form of human life will be a life spent in contact with reality in its fullness, not just with the superficial. This is just the West tradition as a whole. And it's not the exclusive property of the West, because at its foundation is just the acknowledgement that reality is truth, that truth are one, that truth is a whole that contains many truths, but they're all held together in a single coherent order and form, and that the human person by nature is destined to know the truth. So every culture is the practice of people learning how to discern the truth and to respond to it, to form the world in accordance with that truth. About 200 years ago, you begin to see a stirring that associates the arts and the beautiful, and indeed culture as a whole, with disintegrative rather than unitive forces, with decultivating forces rather than cultivating forces. So culture begins to become an anti-culture. And when did that happen? Really, that happened with the French Revolution. Great though that was as a political event, it's always been, in a certain sense, especially for English speakers, overshadowed for what it meant as an intellectual event. It was the first moment where the idea of intelligence, the idea of common sense, or of speaking the truth, was used to actually tear down rather than build up a civilization. And from that moment, a new kind of perverse tradition comes into our culture that didn't exist before. One that's commonly described just as liberalism. What does liberalism do as it begins to mature? Well, liberalism is that ideology that says there are only two things that we can approve as goods that must be pursued. And those two things are freedom and equality. So if you look over the last 200 years of political thought, you'll come across figures, really important figures like Alexis de Tocqueville, who are thinking through what it means to be in political society, largely in terms of freedom and equality. And can these two things coexist? But they don't necessarily call into question those as sort of the foundational terms of political life. That's actually very dangerous. We all acknowledge that being free is good, at least insofar as freedom stands in opposition to some kind of slavish servitude or imprisonment. We all acknowledge that equality is good, insofar as equality means the treating as like that which is actually like. But liberalism didn't propose that the like should be treated as the like, or that freedom was just a good thing in relative speaking to some kind of captivity or servitude. What it proposed is two mutually exclusive ideas, that freedom was an absolute good, so that every form that limits freedom is intrinsically an injustice. But of course, if everybody were radically free in the sense of simply being ungoverned, unformed, unconfined, unattached, then nobody would be equal. Somebody would be oppressing somebody else just in the pure freedom state, pure condition of ungovernedness. Equality, similarly, can hardly be an absolute good, because though we want the like to be treated as the like, we don't want irrelevant differences to conceal from us fundamental similarities. Nobody thinks that simply being treated equal, which is pretty much a negative good in the sense that it's not something good in itself. It's like recovering from an illness. You don't want to be ill, but you don't think of health as simply the highest good that you could ever have in your life. So it is with equality. We want equality where it seems appropriate, but equality as the one definite good after which all civilization sets out as if it were its last, final, and most important quest. That's very empty. So liberalism is just that political philosophy that absolutizes two relative goods, making them the only goods. It's an incoherent ideology because those two things are mutually exclusive, as I said, but it's also a dangerous one because once you're free, you're forced to ask the question that John Paul II proposed to us. Free for what? And if everybody's absolutely equal, so that there's no difference between anyone, if everybody's equal such that everything just seems like a great, vast plane of sameness, or to use T.S. Eliot's old words, that it all seems like protoplasm, that one thing's the same as the other, and we're just in a sort of primordial soup of sameness. What would be the point of that? What's the positive good of that? So liberalism could sustain itself as a kind of ideology for a while that had its arts arts of freedom and its arts of equality. It's works of art that said, we're moving towards freedom, we're moving towards equality. But at some point, it emerged and realized these are not absolute goods. And so there's really been no point to our activity. What would a novel look like? What would a poem look like that just described freedom as the mere absence of oppression? So my argument is that this emergence of an ideology of the French Revolution certainly made the appearance of being a kind of defensive culture. It was active and dynamic, and it proposed as good two clearly definable things, freedom and equality. But in fact, it was vacuous from the beginning. It was nihilistic from the beginning. And what it really did was sought to tear down every edifice that had ever been constructed in order to help human beings become more adequate to the knowledge of what was true, what was good, and what was beautiful. If that's the case, and here I'll end with this, if that's the case, then the first great conservative, Edmund Burke, was the first person to stand in defense of the transcendental properties of being, of truth, goodness, and beauty, against this kind of nihilistic ideology. And he's therefore the great defender of not just a counter-revolutionary past or a pre-revolutionary past. He's the great defender of the whole tradition that our ancestors worked with great difficulty to build up in the first place.
And we'll talk about him in a moment as the sort of founding figure of conservatism. You know, it's interesting. You said, like, what does a novel look like with sort of freedom and equality as core principles? And, you know, there's many, many reasons why modern stories tend to be sort of stuck in darkness and depravity. And one reason for that, though, may be that you need to have sort of conflict without resolution in order to distract from the fact that once you get where you want to be, it's not very interesting. You know, freedom and equality as defined, you know, in modernity are not that interesting. You know, I don't think that you could have a sort of really beautiful depiction of those things. So all we have are characters who lack those things and are striving for those things. But, you know, if they ever got them, I think that it wouldn't be a very fulfilling ending.
Years ago, I used to read a clever magazine called The Baffler, and it had a wonderful article that pointed out that though old curmudgeons sitting on the front porch shaking their fists at the irreverent young have long since faded from history, you can't have, as it were, a Mountain Dew commercial that shows young irreverent surfers who are, you know, enjoying their action beverage, without the commercial also having this old crusty person who disapproves, even though that person doesn't exist. The rebellion of absolute freedom or freedom for its own sake doesn't look interesting if there's no enemy that's being rebelled against. And you would think, well, this is just a clever strategy of, you know, advertising to executives for Pepsi. But if you consider some of the arguments that, say, Rusty Reno has been making the pages of the First Things the last couple of years, you realize how actually deep this goes into our culture. As universities and corporations devote ever greater resources to diversity offices, they feel a sort of complementary obligation to be ever more attentive to policing every possible sign of discrimination. Why? Well, because they have to justify the existence of the diversity office. So there has to be inveterate racists or anti-Semites or sexists or harassers or so on and so forth crawling on every campus so as to justify the existence of these administrators. And then you say, well, why would a university want this extra bloat that they have? Well, it's not really clear in our day what most universities are doing, because they've long since given up the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty on average. They have remolded themselves as essentially liberal institutions that are designed to engineer freedom and equality. And so the very university's self-understanding requires that it be serving in a benighted, racist, sexist society, so that university presidents and the administrations that they govern will have some justification for their own existence. To put it really briefly, they're kind of saying, well, we don't have anything true to teach people, but we can definitely help people to engage in a kind of discernment of conscience to ferret out their unconscious microaggressions and racism. And, you know, that's a new priesthood, and it justifies it helps them to sleep at night and to justify their multi-billion-dollar budgets.
Let's talk a bit about your claim that conservatism is, at least in its origins, fundamentally a literary movement. That may not be surprising to people who are more familiar with the original conservative writers than I am, but I'm most of my familiarity with them has come through reading your book. So maybe starting with Burke, we can talk about what the nature of his critique of the French Revolution.
So let me say a word about the origin of this book, because I think that will answer your question. The first pages of this were written in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 election, where I think our entire country was actually, for once, asking questions that you could find as easily on a bumper sticker as in the minds of the thoughtful. And there were bumper stickers that says, what is it that conservatives want to conserve? And who knows what the author of that bumper sticker was thinking, but it was a legitimate question. Our country was just emerging from the first actions, anyhow, of two prolonged and terrible wars that seemed to have been initiated either based on lies or intellectual error or deliberate deception. The housing crisis had settled, and it seemed that the government actions taken first by the Bush administration and then above all by the Obama administration was going to result in the financial crisis being pretty good for wealthy people and letting the public debt and the public as a whole suffer the consequences. And all of this seemed to have been abetted one way or another by America's supposedly conservative party, the Republican Party under George W. Bush. And it was hard not to look around and say, first of all, what, as a matter of public policy, has our conservative party ever conserved? And then, second of all, to look at beyond institutional politics and look at the changing face of the country and to see that there was very little left in American culture that was genuinely worth conserving and passing on to our children. And that, of course, finds expression amongst other places in the sort of quick movement of the polling needle in polls about the nature of marriage. There were no institutions sufficiently robust in American culture that they could authoritatively remind the public as a whole what are those basic goods that a good life requires. Instead, in fact, step by step, they retreated, giving ground to an ever greater, but also ever more empty account of individualistic freedom and totally incoherent concepts of equality, where obvious differences were to be paved over and rendered, again, just a great barren plain of sameness. Somebody just had to say, well, here's a few things that we could conserve. And so I set out in the book to remind people, anyone who wasn't beholden to the nihilism of mere freedom and mere equality, that our ancestors and our tradition has a few things to teach us. And that in part, in fact, in large part, those lessons are going to be cultural, aesthetic, philosophical, and theological, and most certainly not, first and foremost, political. So the book as a whole takes Burke, who's this great founding figure of political conservatism, his standing athwart the political movements of the French Revolution. And I wanted to begin by reinterpreting him as one of those great, almost prophetic figures who looked on the traditions that were being overturned by revolutionary liberalism and, however imperfectly, realized that there were things there that needed to be preserved, not just because they were nice, but because they were absolutely essential to a flourishing culture and to flourishing human life.
So Burke's argument against the French Revolution was largely aesthetic, largely based on the beauty and sort of sensitivity to the beauty of the things that were being torn down, and the ugliness of, the actions that were taken by the revolutionaries. And what's interesting about it is that you say in the book that even at the time, Burke's opponents recognized that he was making an essentially sort of aesthetic argument in a way. Maybe aesthetic isn't the right word, but an argument based on beauty and sort of sensibility that they felt was irrational, or that he wasn't even bothered to make rational arguments, that he was just appealing to feelings like Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, you quote her criticizing him on those grounds. And that seems to be the beginnings of this separation between what's beautiful and what's rational.
So for Burke, I don't think I talk about this explicitly in the book, but for Burke, the events of the French Revolution were first anticipated or first were sort of mapped out artistically, foreshadowed artistically by Shakespeare's King Lear, where cynical daughters usurp power from their aged father, and they do it largely by trying to reason him to death. They say, oh, you don't need 100 knights. You don't need this fancy train and accompaniment. And Burke looks at that, not Burke, Lear looks at them and says, reason not the need. Man's life is as cheap as a beast if you reduce it to need. For Burke, those daughters, Goneril and Regan, were the first, as it were, utilitarians, the first people to say that only the useful counts. And Burke replies, like Lear. Now, for Lear, beauty is a clothing. It just covers over what would otherwise be the naked beast that is man. Man would just be a poor, bare, forked animal if he didn't cover over and, as it were, deceive himself with the garments of his culture to make his life more noble and more worthy than it in fact at root is. But Burke learned a different lesson from his reading of Lear. It wasn't that culture was this garment that covers over and clothes our otherwise trembling nakedness. Culture is the beautiful elaboration of man's contemplation of the order of things, so that by looking at reality as a whole, we build up, you might say, by looking at the divine or macrocosmic order as Plato instructs us to, we build up at the level of the microcosm, at the level of human culture, institutions that make it possible for us to discern the truth and to live in a way that's worthily obedient to the truth. This building up of institutions, this elaboration of a garment, not that covers us in our bestial quality, but rather that enables us to live the truth more fully, that's culture. And that is foundationally, if you want to use the word in the right way, and there are other ways we could use it, but it's foundationally aesthetic, meaning this: being has beauty intrinsically a part of it, just as it has truth and goodness intrinsically a part of it. These three traditional transcendental properties of being are all one in reality, though we can think about them separately. It's because being has beauty as a quality of it that we can make analogies across otherwise very different levels of reality, talking about the universe as a whole, human culture as a whole, or the individual person as a whole. We can make analogies or discern relationships between these different levels of being. And the way in which we're doing that is by perceiving this quality of beauty or form within these different levels of being. And so what Burke gives us in his reflections on the Revolution in France is a conception of moral and political life as an elaboration in terms of beauty of what we know about reality as a whole. Just as we want to be lovable, and so therefore we want, in some sense, to be lovely, to be beautiful, so a country should be lovely, meaning it should be beautifully formed. Its institutions and its cultural ways and practices, they should be developed with a formal sense so that there's something worthy of our affection. Burke is borrowing from Cicero here, but he's taking Cicero and recovering the roots of Cicero's philosophy in Plato and Aristotle to recognize that to have a good politics, we have to think about being. We have to have a good metaphysics first.
So it's really interesting that you point out a number of, throughout the book, the sort of the development of what the modern intellectual has become is pointed out. And one of the things that you mentioned early on is that starting maybe with Hobbes, intellectuals, philosophers started wanting the world to be less interesting, not more. Everything is a kind of debunking and unveiling of kind of an emptiness. And this starts, long before Marxism or postmodernism, actually.
Yes, indeed. Great 20th century philosopher Iredell Jenkins, not much remembered, but for a handful of articles, very worthy of our memory. Jenkins published, I think during the Second World War, a very important article called The Postulate of an Impoverished Reality. Jenkins' argument was that all the apparent differences between different schools of modern thought, and he gives as an example Hobbes and Locke as a sort of empiricist school of modern philosophy, and then René Descartes as the quintessential rationalist or logicist school of modern philosophy. Says all these differences are irrelevant in comparison with what virtually every modern thinker has in common. Each modern thinker, virtually every characteristically modern thinker, begins with a postulate that reality is less in itself than it appears in experience. So I began by talking about Plato's Republic. Life on the surface of things just looks like a series of appearances. It looks very superficial, but if we engage in philosophical reason, we will go deeper and go beyond appearances into the depths and the riches of reality, which of course Plato describes not as depths, but as heights. We'll leave the cave of shadows and come out into the light of the sun and ascend from there to the highest reaches of being. From, in fact, becoming to the realm of being. From a place of images to a place where the genuine good is situate. Modern thinking says just the opposite. It's all modeled on Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, as it were, where the farther you go into reality, the more likely you are the more inclined you become to just crying out the horror that what appears good at first is in fact deeply impoverished, is empty in reality. And so I proposed that we have to stand athwart, that the conservative is one who stands athwart both the political destruction of modern liberal ideology, but also the more profound and earlier destruction of these various schools of modern thought that have all in common this postulate of the impoverished reality, and try to recover a vision of being where we see that everything, insofar as it's real, is true, is good, and is beautiful. Why? Well, nobody does anything except in pursuit of some good. We're surrounded, we're swarming, each of us, with all kinds of persons and things and ideas that are proposing themselves to us as good. So nobody doubts that in at least one manner of speaking, that things are good. What we do doubt amid this sort of phantasmagoria is the possibility of there being any one good for which you should live your life. So the first thing I had to do was to recover a vision of the good, that human beings are called to some particular end, just as every other item in the world is clearly called to some particular end. We know what a tree looks like when it's functioning well, when it's doing what trees do the right way, and we know when a tree is sick. We know the same with animals. We know the same with household appliances like toasters and microwaves. We know when they're working and when they're not. For some reason, modern thought has introduced the possibility that human beings are the exception amid this great land of things that that perform their own good, that human beings have no particular good. Or if there is a good, it's the vacuous good of just to be free and to be equal. Free for what? Equal to what? So the first thing that I had to recover was the Western tradition's vision of the human good, that human beings are called to the contemplation of truth, goodness, and beauty, and through those three transcendentals are called to communion with God. Once we establish that, then we move from goodness to beauty and on to truth.
If we're talking about conserving, the central insights and values of the Western tradition, a lot of people identify those in a lot of different ways. Perhaps we could just very quickly even just maybe list a few of the things that people get distracted by, which are more like epiphenomena or side benefits of the central insights of the Western tradition. People talk about, the rule of law or political freedoms or things like that, but that's not really the fundamental thing that we need to conserve.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, you could tell how corrupted our cultures become, that if you were to go into a college classroom, any faculty member you might find there would surely say, yeah, oh, it's important to be Socratic. It's important to imitate Socrates. It's important to have a knowledge from or to follow in his way of practice. But then you ask, well, what is this practice? What does Socrates mean to you, sir? And the person would reply, oh, it means critical thinking. Now, of course, nobody disapproves of critical thinking because it's practically a vacuous term. It could mean all kinds of things. What it usually ends up meaning is a kind of thinking that simply sees behind or sees through every proposed truth and reveals it to be just an ideological appearance rather than an actual insight on the truth. Socratic thinking in that way is disintegrative. It's simply the claim of the ancient skeptics that while I can't prove what is genuinely true, good, or beautiful, I can come up with clever arguments or modes that will put you in doubt about what you think is true, good, and beautiful. Well, in a manner of speaking, that's a fair enough account of, say, the Socrates of the Apology, though not really. It's not an account of the Socrates we find in the Republic, the Socrates of the Phaedrus, the Socrates of the Symposium. What do we find there? There we find just the man that I was describing earlier, the one who says that human beings are born for the contemplation of the light of truth. And so critical reflection, philosophical reflection, the study of the liberal arts is entirely ordered to, yes, the liberation of man from a few complacencies and illusions, but for the sake of pursuing a much richer, fuller, and genuinely fulfilling contemplation of reality as such, which is reality as we see it, as created by and ordered to God. So our institutions are leading us, as it were, not just astray, but in the opposite direction that they nominally are supposed to take us.
So perhaps we should get to the core of the first part of your book, which is your discussion of the six fundamental insights of the Western tradition, which you refer to as Christian Platonism. And just to address that term really quickly, you're not saying it's Platonism as opposed to Aristotelianism or as opposed to Thomism. It's this broad stream of sort of based on these insights that have been accepted by all of these thinkers if worked out in various ways technically.
That's right. So when I use the term Christian Platonism, as you say, I use it in the broadest possible sense as really a very convenient term for identifying the Western tradition as the tradition that has grown up out of those two dispensations, as it were, of Athens and Jerusalem. And so why Christianity? Well, because Christ reveals the fullness of truth to us, without question. But why Plato as opposed to, say, Homer, who was earlier? Well, because if we went back to, as it were, the immediate background of the foundation of Western civilization in ancient Athens, as Alistair McIntyre argues, all the debates are being conducted in terms of Homer. So my proposal is that Plato's account of Homer is the one that wins out and goes on to shape the West as we know it today. So there was a moment where Plato was a sort of breaking off from an earlier tradition, but you might say Plato was the fulfillment of an earlier tradition and becomes then one of two foundation stones, two cornerstones, for a bad metaphor there, of what the West was to become. So what is the West? My proposal is that there are six, I call them variously canons, insights, general propositions that the Western tradition considers foundational. And there are all kinds of different accounts or disputes within these six big points. But these are the six things that are just, as it were, taken on as assumptions. And so within whose framework everything else gets worked out. Everything else becomes, as it were, a footnote to Christian Platonism. So Christian Platonism proposes six things. One, that man is an intellectual animal. man is, by nature, has the capacity to know the truth. And he has the capacity to know the truth because in virtue of his spiritual or non-material intellect, he's able to enter into intellectual or spiritual relationship with all other beings. That's what it means to have an intellect. A chair is just a chair. It has the form of chair. It doesn't and can't be anything else without having that form destroyed and another one imposed upon it. The mind of every intellectual being is one that's capable of receiving other forms without having its own form vitiated or destroyed. And so it's in virtue of our having an intellect that we're capable of entering into relationship with other things. In consequence, man's nature is founded on a prior or foundational intelligibility in the world, and he's intellectually and erotically oriented toward a transcendent knowledge of it. That is to say, we know things, and our reason operates on the assumption of first principles that are already in us, but which we didn't have to discover for ourselves before we could start reasoning. This is where a lot of modern thinking goes awry, assumes you have to prove first principles before you can say you know anything. Well, you can't know something without knowing it. So it would seem that we're already in the act of knowing. One of the things that we do, however, upon reflection, is to dig down and see that the only reason we can know the truth about things, the only thing we can perform acts of reasoning, is because we've already received as a gift, as an inborn reality, the principles of the intellect that allow it to do what it does. And further, we see that from those first principles, through the long journey or pilgrimage of our reasoning, that we're clearly striving towards something. The intellect has a good proper to itself, as Dante would tell us. The good of the intellect is truth. And a full vision of truth is something, in a manner of speaking, that's more than the truth. What is that? Well, my third principle is this dual orientation, intellectual and erotic orientation towards a transcendent knowledge of reality. This dual orientation proceeds by way of reason towards an intellectual vision perceptive of beauty itself, with a capital B, which is the splendor of truth. The most ancient definition in the Western tradition of beauty is, well, in Latin, veritatis splendor, the splendor of truth. A truth is a form, an essential appearance where you say, now I see it. But no one truth, however small, is merely itself. If I have the number 1, for instance, as soon as I know what the number 1 is, I'm launched on an adventure of discovering the number 1's relationship to other numbers and to plus and minus and multiplication. That is to say, every truth exists in itself. It has its own form or essence, to use the ancient language that I think actually is the most adequate language. And by being itself, it stands in a definite relationship to perhaps an infinity of other truths, other realities, so that finally the truth as a whole is one. When we perceive truth as a whole as one, we see that everything we know stands in splendorous relationship with everything else. Just as the way that the sun sends out its rays and communicates its warmth and its light to everything else that is, so the Christian Platonist tradition proposes to us that reality is that way. That reality is created by God, and that God communicates and therefore puts himself into relationship with everything else that exists. And everything else that exists, therefore, stands not only in relationship with God, but to everything else. And so that idea of radiance or claritas or splendor coming out of things is in fact that sense that we already have or that we perceive of things standing in intelligible relationship to each other. Now, here's the big argument. What I'm proposing, therefore, is that truth, the truth about things, is in itself intrinsically beautiful. And I want to go farther. It has to be beautiful. And it's only because the truth is beautiful. It's only because beauty is veritas splendor, the splendor of truth, that we understand why it is that we want to know the truth in the first place. There are plenty of people who think they only want to know the truth because they're trying to get ahead in the world. They want to know just enough truth to figure out how to be a good accountant or how to be a good used car salesman or, how to conquer a small country. Most people have a sort of shriveled rationalistic vision of their destiny. But in fact, we want to know the truth because when we see the truth whole, we attain wisdom. And the state of contemplation that is made possible by the achievement of wisdom is not simply a good in itself. It's the good. It's the thing we desire more than anything. What we really desire, of course, is to know all things in their relationship to the one who made them. And so the fourth insight is that the world as a whole is itself ordered by and to duty. The world is made by God and ordered to God, and not God in some bare, unknowing way, but God in this fullness of his radiance that causes things to be and that calls things back to know him and to stand in loving relationship with him through that knowledge. So God is the divine beauty, but also God as the cause of every earthly beauty that causes all things to hold or inhere as a intelligible whole. So that fourth point speaks primarily about the nature of reality as a whole. The fifth one turns to us. That human dignity specifically consists in our capacity to perceive and contemplate that splendorous order. And thus the most excellent form of human life is that which is given over to such contemplation. This is, in a sense, will sound kind of controversial. Most people will say that, many people will say that the most excellent form of life is some kind of action in the world. But I think we all know that that's not true, precisely because we all know that knowing has to be involved in the purpose of our lives. If we stand before truth and contemplate it, nobody's going to say, why would you want to do that? It's the one true end in itself. I think back to the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle gives a wonderful demonstration that the contemplative life is the good life for man. And I love the kind of the rhetoric of his demonstration of the truth, because he says, for instance, nobody would fight a war for its own sake, right? So attaining glory in war can't be a good in itself. It has to be only a useful good, because we wouldn't want to fight war for its own sake. We would want to fight a war so as to secure peace so that we can then live peacefully and do something else. I'm sure everybody who listened to him that day nodded approvingly because they were too embarrassed to say, actually, gosh, I don't know. I kind of thought fighting a war was a good in itself because by fighting in a war, I could show my courage. And by showing my courage, even if I die, I could be viewed as glorious. And that glory would make me an immortal, someone who would be remembered down through history for decades, centuries, perhaps forever. Aristotle says, no, this is not the case. Because, of course, if glory were the end, we would have an incoherence. Something that's not really good in itself would be being treated as good in itself. Why isn't glory good in itself? Well, glory, as Aristotle's contemporaries understood it, was simply a splendor or an effulgence that came from having done something good, fought well in a battle. The glory itself, therefore, was just a sort of fruit, but it wasn't a real end. How do we know that? Well, imagine somebody had unearned glory. Nobody wants to be undeserving of glory. Nobody really wants to be, in contemporary terms, a mere celebrity, where everyone looks at you in your glory and then looks at you a little more closely and realizes that you have not one virtue proper to yourself that's actually worthy of admiration. Hence, I think the self-destructiveness of so many celebrity lives is that they're forced constantly to reckon with the emptiness of their own success. So the only success that doesn't abandon us in the end is the success of standing in contemplation of the truth in all of its beauty. This is the most excellent form of human life. But then we say, what is that? Why should that be so good? And so the sixth insight tells us, this contemplation realizes itself in what we may call happiness or salvation. And it is characterized by an activity that resembles passivity. That is to say, not simply the absence of motion, but a fullness of activity that's called peace and freedom. What I was trying to get at with this insight is that so much of our lives is spent feeling that we're either passive, we're being acted upon, mere employees or functionaries or servants, or we reach out and seize activity. We're the ones who act upon others. We're bosses or commanders or executives. But we see that neither of these positions is ever final, right? I might be the boss of my children until my wife tells me to do something else. I go from being the active to the passive person. These are very partial positions that are never fully expressive of who we are. And they're also very partial in the sense that they're not everlasting. What we're really striving for is a condition of happiness where we say, yes, here I have arrived. I need not go anywhere else because what I have found here is infinitely good so that it can never be surpassed because it is itself unsurpassingly good. And so we have to understand that not in terms of the question, what next? Because there is no next. How would you get beyond what's infinitely good? Well, yeah, but what are you going to do after that? Well, Socrates tells us happiness is the possession of the good forever. So there is no after. It's everlasting. It's only in this act of contemplation that we transcend all those partial positions of activity and passivity and become simply fulfilled, filled up in such a way with what is good that there's no further good that we have to go chasing. If we don't have this sixth position, there are a number of things that we can never understand, including we can't understand how life could actually be purposeful, how life is not just a succession of, in the long term, meaningless pursuits of this good or that good or this good or that good, but is rather life is one pilgrimage, one quest to find our destiny, to be fulfilled, and to stand within that fulfillment ever after.
I hope we can talk again more about how to overcome rationalism, because that was one of the big takeaways that I had from your book, that the degree to which rationalism has wrought devastation on our culture and on our minds, the degree to which we actually, whether even believing Catholics, think in a way that's fundamentally different from, the ancient people or the pre-modern people. Could you just quickly, before you go, explain the difference between, when you talk about the vision of the intellect, the difference between that and what we call reason?
Sure. Well, so in the Christian Platonist tradition, the intellect is the essence of the soul. And within the intellect, there's a particular way of thinking called reasoning. And reasoning is characteristically human, but it's founded on the first principles of the intellect that make reasoning possible. This sounds like kind of scholastic hair splitting, but it's very important for understanding what it means to be human. Reason, discursive reason, as it's generally called, it moves from point to point, from 2 to the plus, to the 2, to the equals, to the 4. And then once it gets to the 4, it says, well, then 4 and 4 are 8, and so on and so forth. It's discursive in that it's always moving down a passage toward the truth. But when we have a fullness of truth, we see the truth, which we all know, because we're all Christian Platonists, even whether we know it or not. We all say things like, now I see what you mean, right? And if you're starting to understand somebody, you say, I hear you. But then once you really hear somebody, you see what they mean. We all have a sense of the truth as form, as appearance, as an appearance that is splendorous. It's only because our intellectual activities are not limited to that sort of haphazard, active, slow plodding, journeying, discursive reasoning. It's only because we have the capacity to finally, at the end of all our searching, sit back and simply see the truth, and in a manner of speaking, let it see us, that we can ever hope that there will be an end to all our striving. And finally, a peace that's not a cessation of activity, but rather a fullness of activity. A peace that's not simply, not simply one more good thing that we know, but a peace that says, I have arrived now, the place I've been looking for all of my life. All of this is founded on the idea of the soul having the capacity for intellectual vision. And that's why I had to call the book The Vision of the Soul.
Well, thank you for that. And hopefully next time we can talk about the other ways of arriving at this intellectual vision, besides discursive reason, and why the true philosopher is not necessarily defined as someone who sits in front of a book and, makes sort of logical, formal arguments about things.
That's right. Yeah, we'll definitely have to pick up with that because we're making a big claim that there's a particular way to live life that's most excellent. And it's a life that involves everybody, in a manner of speaking, becoming a philosopher, and not the way contemporary culture tells us to become philosophers. Contemporary culture seems to be, especially in America, seems to be modeled on Melville's The Confidence Man, where you presume everybody's lying to you. And so you want to be an educated one is the one who sees through everybody else's lies. That's a good way to survive for a little while, but it's no way to live.
Okay, James, thank you. Talk to you again soon.
Great, Tom. Thanks.
In case you didn't know, the Catholic Culture Podcast is just one of 3 podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. First, there's Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina. Mike is at the top of his field as far as presenting the stories and insights of the Church Fathers in a highly engaging and accessible manner. We've also got Catholic Culture audiobooks. These are free, professionally produced recordings of the writings of great Catholics like St. John Henry Newman and the Fathers of the Church. So you can check those out at CatholicCulture.org/podcast. And if you enjoy them, please share them with your friends. And I'll see you next week for more with James Matthew Wilson.